Well, thank you for asking me to introduce this very interesting film. The film you're about to see is based, of course, I'm sure you know, on a famous memoir by Vera Brittain, who was a young middle-class woman brought up in the north of England, and she was 21 at the outbreak of war, just 21. She just started studying for a degree in English at Somerville College in Oxford when her younger brother Edward and his friends Victor, who you'll see, Roland and Geoffrey, enlisted to fight in the war. In 1915, Vera suspended her studies to volunteer as an auxiliary nurse. And this put her in the midst of the horrors of war. She was posted to both France and Malta. She also served in England to start off with. And this experience forms, of course, the core of Testament of Youth, the marvellous memoir that she wrote later. The book was published in 1933 by Victor Galantz, and it was widely acclaimed and was immediately a popular success. In the first 6 years of its publication, it sold over 120,000 copies. But why did she write it? Vera Brittain wanted very much to show the whole war and the post-war period and what it meant to young men and women who she referred to as the depleted generation, those who grew up just before the First World War. As she put it, the war smashed up her youth. A momentous period that brought about great changes, as she put it, in the minds and lives of very different groups of individuals belonging to the large section of middle-class society from which her family came. At first, she planned the book as a novel, but this didn't work. Then she tried reproducing parts of her long diary, which she wrote, they covered the years 1913 to 1918, but she changed people's names. But this didn't work either. Neither approach to her felt authentic or equal to the task. So she opted for telling her own story as truthfully as she could against the larger background. She aimed, as she put it, to put the life of an ordinary individual into its niche in contemporary history, and thus illustrate the influence of worldwide events and movements on the personal destinies of men and women. Her writing was impassioned by a desire to show that people should not be passive. Again, I quote her, "It may be that our generation will go down in history as the first to understand that not a single man or woman can now live in disregarding isolation from his or her world." Now, the memoir makes clear that Vera Brittain is important for her vivid involvement in three important historical strands. The first is, of course, the First World War and her role as a nurse, then not a particularly highly regarded profession. She left Oxford to become a nurse. It was a considerably difficult experience for her in many respects, but she's part of that important strand of history, working history and history of the war. Also, she's very important, as becomes clear in the memoir, in the history of pacifism and her absolute involvement in the League of Nations and her great pleas for peace after the First World War and into the coming up of the Second World War. So that history, she's very, very much a player. She changed when she returned to Oxford after the war. Incidentally, she changed her subject from English, as it had been before, to history, because she really wanted to understand the impact of international relations and why the war had happened, what had gone wrong. The third strand, of course, is feminism. She went to university, as you'll see, against, in the beginning her father was against that. She was a woman very interested in the suffrage movement. Again, as Testament of Youth makes very clear, she's absolutely passionate about the advancement of women's issues, both in politics and in legal affairs and that kind of thing. So those three major strands, that's why she's very important and a very important figure. And as Shirley Williams points out in the introduction to one of the editions of Testament of Youth, her book is actually a very unusual female perspective on the First World War. Mostly, for the majority of cases, it's always men's perspectives that have been recorded. So after the initial popular success of the book, it actually had quite an interesting history. After its initial popular success, its overt pacifism fell out of favour, particularly in the run-up to the Second World War. But then, in 1978, Virago republished it, a long time afterwards, but this was the first republication, and possibly this was influenced by 1970s feminism, possibly in the aftermath of anti-war sort of sentiment after the Vietnam War finished in 1975. Testament of Youth was first adapted for the screen in 1979, and it was an award-winning 5-part BBC TV miniseries, and it starred Cheryl Campbell, and I expect there might be some of you here who remember that. It is available on DVD. But for many, this was a faithful, moving adaptation that took just under 5 hours of screen time. So they had double the time than you'll see in this film, which I think is an interesting issue, to translate a book that comes up to just under 700 pages. And so, again, the issues of that adaptation we will talk about, I'm sure. But this film, of course, the context for its appearance is the anniversary of the First World War, and, of course, our recent experience of conflict ourselves, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But just to touch on some of the issues of adaptation that I think these series of iterations of Testament of Youth raise, it's a very interesting prospect for the whole project of adaptation. The book's unusual in that it contains a large number of letters, diary entries, and poems. As an aspiring writer, Vera Brittain was acutely aware of the historical importance of literary records, engaging in frequent correspondence with her brother Edward and her fiancé Roland, many of which are quoted in the book. Letter writing was the main way the friends kept in touch, and Vera made sure that her letters to the front were actually posted back to her for safekeeping. So what we have is a wonderful record of both sides of the correspondence, and this, of course, is very unusual. Letters could be a comfort. They could also bring suspense, anxious moments waiting for news, and, of course, a void of loneliness when they didn't appear and when they ceased. The TV series tries to convey this key element of Testament of Youth, and it includes quite a lot of voiceover narrations of the letters and poems. And I think it's interesting to see, you might want to think about the extent to which it's possible to capture some of that in the film, and how it might choose to do this in the somewhat truncated time that it has in comparison with the TV series. The inevitable process of compression meant that the film's screenwriter had to reduce or even cut episodes from the book. For example, we don't see Vera's time in Malta, which affected her profoundly for its warm, even exotic and colourful contrast to the sort of brown khaki-ness of the Western Fronts. And I think those passages about Malta are amazing for their description of flowers and colours, and you really get a sense of her being sort of sensuously almost experiencing a completely different climate, in the spite of the fact that she is still serving as a nurse there and the war is going round all around her. But that they decided to leave that out of the film. And there are a few other changes that some of you might know about, might spot, but I won't spoil it. I'll wait until afterwards and we can discuss those. So before the film, I just want to perhaps signal a few things you might want to think about when you're watching it. I suppose there's the huge question of, well, how does it portray war? Does it convey Vera's point of view, and is it able to adequately deal with the soldiers' perspectives? Because that's also, of course, extremely important. The three friends, the three musketeers, and who were at school together, and then Geoffrey, who Edward met later. Are we able to get anything of their experience? Because obviously the main perspective is that of Vera. How does Roland come across? Interesting character, particularly when compared with Vera's recollections of him in the memoir. His status as an author of poems and letters that comes across very strongly in the memoir, somewhat of a sort of deceit character. And for those of you who remember it, the TV series, how does Roland compare with that rendition? Both Vera and the young men change greatly due to their war experiences. How successful is the film in conveying this key aspect of the memoir? The memoir was a moving testament to a lost generation. Does the film fully capture the pity of war that Vera Brittain was so keen to expose? Vera Brittain was a lifelong pacifist. Does this come across strongly in the film? Finally, just a few cast and kind of production details that may or may not have relevance, but again, you might want to think about them. The director, James Kent, best known for documentaries, for example, The Genius of Mozart, Philip Larkin, Love and Death in Hull. Television biodramas, he's made films about Elizabeth David and Margaret Thatcher. Again, interesting directorial choice. Does it have any impact? Can you see documentary influences? You might want to think about that. The casting is sort of, again, interesting. Alicia Vikander plays Vera, a Swedish actress, a trained ballerina, maybe not very well known to people. Interesting, again, not a star persona. If Keira Knightley had played Vera, would that have made much of a difference? Again, you might, obviously, the choice of stars is interesting, as it is with the casting of Kit Harington as Roland, who's best known, of course, for his appearance in Game of Thrones. So he's kind of a bit of a kind of, you know, big pick sort of heartthrob character. So again, what difference does this make to the casting of Roland for contemporary audiences? And then I suppose it's interesting to know about the writer, Juliette Tahidi. She's written TV miniseries Death Comes to Pemberley and Calendar Girls. Again, that choice of writer is often interesting because of this sort of special issues to do with adaptation that I mentioned earlier around this film.